Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Deep beneath the surface of a forgotten world, where silence has reigned for 60 million years, something stirs. Ancient systems flicker to life, their emerald glow cutting through darkness that predates humanity itself. The awakening has begun, but this time, the Necrons of the tomb world are not alone. Within their sacred crypts, preserved by technologies beyond mortal comprehension, lies something that should not exist here. Something that radiates power even in stillness. A son of the Emperor. A demigod of humanity. A Primarch. The story of how such an encounter might unfold touches upon some of the most fascinating elements of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It bridges the ancient past with the turbulent present, connecting two of the setting's most powerful forces in ways that could reshape the fate of the galaxy. To understand this momentous discovery, we must first journey back through the ages, to when the Necrons made their fateful choice to sleep. The long sleep of the undying. 60 million years ago, when Earth was still home to dinosaurs and humanity was countless millennia from existing, the Necrons made a decision that would echo through the ages. They had won their war against the Old Ones, those ancient beings who had denied them the very thing they craved most, relief from the curse of short, painful lives. The Necrontyre, as they were then known, had been a flesh and blood species, brilliant and ambitious, but plagued by cancers and genetic deterioration caused by the harsh radiation of their dying sun. In their desperation, they had struck a bargain with the star gods themselves, the Satan, that those terrible entities of pure energy that fed upon the very essence of stars. The Satan had promised them immortality, and they had delivered on that promise, though the price was far higher than the Necrontyre could have imagined. Through a process called biotransference, every Necrontyre consciousness was torn from its mortal shell and imprisoned within a body of living metal, a substance known as necrodermis. They became the Necrons, deathless and undying, but at the cost of nearly everything that had made them truly alive. The transformation was not equal among their kind. The nobility, the pharaohs and overlords who had ruled the Necrontyre dynasties received bodies of the finest construction, sophisticated enough to preserve much of their personality, their wit, their cunning. These were machines of terrible beauty, whilst capable of thought and strategy, ambition and pride. Below them came the lords and the military elite, their forms adequate but lesser, retaining enough consciousness to lead, but robbed of the full spectrum of emotion they had once known. For the common people, however, the fate was cruel beyond measure. The vast majority of the Necrontyre population was translated into bodies that were little more than lobotomized automata. The spark of self that remained was barely enough to torment them with vague memories of what they had lost. These became the Necron warriors, silent and implacable, capable of following orders with perfect precision, but devoid of any true will of their own. Death would have been a mercy, but death was no longer possible for them. With their new immortal forms, the Necrons turned the tide against the Old Ones. Yet the war in heaven raged across the galaxy, reshaping the very fabric of reality itself. The Necrons and their Satan masters proved unstoppable, driving the Old Ones to extinction and shattering their greatest creations. But victory came at a terrible price. The war had ravaged the galaxy, leaving it a wasteland populated by warp-spawned horrors called enslavers that fed upon any psychic presence they could find. The Silent King, Sarek, the last of his title and the supreme ruler of all Necron dynasties, looked upon this devastated galaxy and realized that ruling it would be meaningless. His people had won their war, but there was nothing left worth having. The younger races that the Old Ones had seeded across the stars, the Eldar and others, were beginning to rise, and the warp had become far more dangerous than it had ever been. And more importantly, Sarek had come to understand the full horror of what had been done to his people. In a moment of clarity and remorse, he turned on the Satan themselves. The war against the star gods was brief, but cataclysmic. Using weapons designed specifically to harm beings of living energy, the Necrons shattered the Satan into countless shards, each one trapped within dimensional prisons called tesseract labyrinths. These shards still possessed terrible power, but they could be controlled, used as weapons or tools rather than masters. With the Satan defeated, Zarek made his final decision as the Silent King. He ordered the construction of vast tomb complexes on thousands of worlds across the galaxy. These would be more than simple burial chambers. They would be stasis crypts of incredible sophistication, designed to preserve the Necrons through the ages until the galaxy had recovered enough to be worth conquering again. The technology required was staggering. Each tomb world was equipped with systems capable of maintaining millions or even billions of dormant Necrons for eons, protected by automated defenses and watched over by non-sentient canoptech constructs, machines designed solely to maintain and repair. The tombs were built deep underground, far below the surface of their chosen worlds, hidden from detection and shielded from the passage of time. Some were placed on worlds that had been Necrontyre colonies, where surface structures still stood as monuments to their vanished civilization. Others were hidden on barren rocks or worlds that showed no obvious signs of past habitation. The locations were chosen with care, in considering factors like geological stability, distance from major warp storms, and strategic value for the eventual reconquest. Before entering the Great Sleep, Zarek did something that shocked his remaining nobles to their very cores. He destroyed the command protocols that bound all Necrons to his absolute will. For millions of years, every Necron, from the lowest warrior to the mightiest overlord, had been bound by unbreakable neural commands that forced them to obey the Silent King without question. These protocols had been part of the original biotransference, a safeguard demanded by the Satan to ensure their new servants could never rebel. By destroying these protocols, Zarek freed his people, giving them back the autonomy they had lost. It was an act of contrition, yet an acknowledgement that he had led them into a trap from which they could never truly escape. He hoped that when they awakened, they would have the freedom to choose their own destinies, to rebuild their civilization according to their own desires rather than his commands. Then, without explanation to anyone, the Silent King departed the galaxy entirely, vanishing into the intergalactic void on a self-imposed exile that would last for millions of years. As the Necrons entered their stasis crypts, the galaxy moved on without them. The enslavers gradually died out as psychic life became scarce. The Eldar rose to prominence, creating an empire of unparalleled sophistication and power that would span millions of years. They became the dominant force in the galaxy, and they did not forget the threat the Necrons represented. Eldar raiders hunted down tomb worlds, destroying what they could find, but the vast majority of Necron crypts remained undiscovered, protected by their own cunning concealment. Time passed in ways that are difficult for mortal minds to comprehend. Entire species rose and fell. Stars were born and died. Continental drift reshaped the surfaces of tomb worlds. In some cases, the very planets themselves were destroyed by astronomical events, cosmic impacts, or stellar catastrophes, taking their sleeping Necrons with them into oblivion. Other tombs suffered more insidious fates. System failures, programming errors, or damage from external forces caused cascade failures that destroyed sections of the crypts, sometimes spreading to consume entire tomb complexes. Billions of Necrons were lost in these silent disasters, dying in their sleep, without ever knowing that their dreams of awakening would never come to pass. The tomb worlds that survived did so through a combination of superior engineering and sheer luck. Their systems cycled through self-maintenance routines millions of times, each one a check against the inexorable decay that threatened to undo even the most perfect technology. The canoptech constructs worked tirelessly, repairing damage, replacing failed components, hunting down and eliminating any threats that dared to enter the tomb complexes. These machines, though mindless, were driven by programming of such sophistication that they could adapt to threats and circumstances that their creators could never have anticipated. Within the stasis crypts themselves, the sleeping Necrons existed in a state that was neither life nor death. Though their consciousness was dimmed almost to nothing, their thoughts reduced to the barest flickers of awareness. Some dreamed, after a fashion, experiencing fragmentary visions drawn from memories of their flesh and blood past. Others existed in a void of perfect darkness, sensation and thought suspended entirely. For them, the 60 million years would pass in what seemed like an instant, though the reality was far more complex. Time, after all, is a strange thing when consciousness itself becomes intermittent. The sleepers had no way to mark its passage, no way to know how long they had rested. When the awakening protocols would eventually engage, triggered by pre-programmed conditions or external stimuli, it would seem to many of them as if only moments had passed since they had closed their eyes. Others, particularly those of higher rank whose consciousness was more preserved, might have some sense of the vast gulf of time that had passed, a feeling of displacement and wrongness that would take time to shake off. The tomb worlds waited in their silence, scattered across the galaxy in patterns that had long since lost their original strategic significance. The galaxy they had known was gone, replaced by something entirely different. New species had evolved and spread across the stars. The Eldar, so long dominant, had fallen into a decadence that would eventually bring about their own near extinction. And in a remote corner of the galaxy, on a world called Earth, a species of primitive apes was beginning its long evolutionary journey towards something the universe had never seen before. Humanity would eventually rise to become a galactic power in its own right, seeding itself across thousands of worlds during the Dark Age of technology, then falling into ignorance and superstition during Old Night, only to be reunited by a being of transcendent power who called himself the Emperor of Mankind. But that is a story for later. For now, in the time of the Great Sleep, humanity was nothing, less than a whisper of potential in a galaxy where titans slumbered. The awakening, when it would finally begin, was not meant to happen all at once. The tomb worlds were designed to revive their occupants in stages, a careful process that would begin with the canoptech constructs activating higher functions, then proceed to wake the cryptech technomasters who would assess the status of the tomb. Only when these technomages had verified that conditions were safe would the true awakening begin, starting with the warrior contingents and building up to the nobles and overlords who commanded them. This process was intended to take years, sometimes even decades or centuries, depending on the sophistication of the tomb's programming and the specific conditions that had triggered the awakening. It was meant to be orderly, careful, giving the Necrons time to assess the current state of the galaxy before committing to full reactivation. But the cosmos rarely conforms to even the best-laid plans, and the awakening of the Necrons has proven to be anything but orderly. Some tombs have awakened too early, triggered by geological upheavals or interference from the curious younger races. These premature activations have sometimes resulted in disaster, with insufficient systems online to support the awakening Necrons, or with threats already at the tomb's doorstep before defenses could be properly established. Others have awakened too late, finding that the galaxy has changed so much that their ancient strategic plans are utterly obsolete. And some have suffered from degradation during the long sleep, with their awakening nobles emerging damaged in mind or body, their consciousness corrupted by system failures or the simple erosion of time. The 41st millennium has seen a dramatic increase in Necron awakenings. The birth of the Great Rift, that massive wound in reality that has split the galaxy in two, has caused warp storms and reality distortions that have triggered awakening protocols on countless tomb worlds. The return of the Silent King from his self-imposed exile has accelerated this process as he travels from world to world, deliberately activating tombs and rallying the scattered dynasties to face the threat of the Tyranids, those terrible creatures from beyond the galactic rim that devour all life in their path. But even with these mass awakenings, the vast majority of Necrons still sleep. Billions upon billions of them remain dormant, waiting for their turn to rise, for the right conditions to trigger their activation protocols, or for someone or something to disturb their rest. The galaxy today is dotted with these sleeping time bombs, tomb worlds that could awaken at any moment, each one capable of projecting tremendous military power and ancient technological superiority. It is into this context that we must place our scenario. At somewhere in the galaxy, on a tomb world that has perhaps only recently begun its awakening sequence, the Necrons are about to make a discovery that will confound even their ancient wisdom. Within their sacred crypts, in a chamber that should contain only their own kind, or perhaps captured specimens from the war in heaven, they have found something that should not exist. An intruder who has been sleeping alongside them, preserved by their own stasis technology, or perhaps by something else entirely. A being of immense power, genetically crafted to be the pinnacle of human achievement, bearing within its very cells the legacy of humanity's greatest leader, a Primarch. And the discovery of this demigod will set in motion events that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. The sons of the Emperor. To understand what the Necrons have discovered, we must first understand what a Primarch truly is. These beings are not merely enhanced humans, not simply super soldiers or genetic experiments. They are something far more profound, creatures that blur the line between the material and the immaterial, between flesh and spirit, between the possible and the miraculous. Each Primarch represents a pinnacle of bioengineering combined with psychic crafting on a scale that only one being in the galaxy has ever achieved. The Emperor of Mankind stands as one of the most powerful psykers who has ever existed. Born in ancient times, long before recorded history, he has walked among humanity throughout its entire existence, guiding, protecting, and manipulating human development from the shadows. By the Age of Strife, when humanity's first galactic civilization collapsed into chaos and horror, the Emperor decided that subtle guidance was no longer sufficient. Humanity needed a leader who could unite it by force if necessary, and an army capable of reconquering the stars in his name. The Thunder Warriors were his first attempt at creating superhuman soldiers. These were enhanced humans of tremendous strength and ferocity, capable of taking on any foe in the savage wars that would unite Earth's warring factions under the Emperor's banner. But the Thunder Warriors were flawed, their bodies unstable, their minds prone to aggression and instability. They were perfect for the unification wars on Terra, but they could not be the army that would reconquer the galaxy. For that, the Emperor needed something better. Is something that could endure for centuries and maintain discipline across vast distances. The Space Marines, also called the Adeptus Astartes, would be that army. These warriors were created using gene seed derived from incredibly sophisticated genetic templates, each one capable of transforming a normal human into a post-human warrior of tremendous capability. But where would these templates come from? The Emperor could have used his own genetic material, but that alone would not be sufficient. He needed variety, different specializations, distinct advantages that could be deployed tactically depending on the situation. He needed the Primarchs. The creation of the Primarchs took place in gene laboratories hidden deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in vaults protected by the most powerful wards and defenses the Emperor could devise. And he used his own genetic material as the foundation, but that was only the beginning. The Emperor had traveled through a warp gate on the world of Molech during the Age of Technology, where he bargained with the powers of the Imperium itself, gaining knowledge and abilities that allowed him to achieve what should have been impossible. Each Primarch was designed to embody a specific aspect of warfare, a particular excellence that would make them perfect for their intended role. One would be the ultimate strategist, capable of planning campaigns across entire sectors with perfect precision. Another would master the art of fortification and defensive warfare. A third would become the epitome of the berserker, channeling rage into a weapon of terrible power. Yet another would wield psychic abilities that rivaled even the Emperor's own. Then 20 distinct templates were created, each one unique, each one perfect in its own way. But the Primarchs were more than just genetic constructs. The Emperor imbued them with something from the warp itself, a spark of divine essence that made them more than mortal. They possessed souls of incredible power, psychic presences that burned like stars in the Imperium. This was what gave them their unnatural charisma, the ability to inspire absolute loyalty in their followers and strike fear into their enemies with mere presence. It was what allowed them to grow at an accelerated rate, learning in days what would take others years. And it was what made them targets for the Chaos Gods. The ruinous powers of chaos had watched the Emperor's machinations with growing concern. They understood that if he succeeded in his plans, and he would create a secular, rational Imperium that would starve them of worship and belief, humanity would turn its back on superstition and religion, embracing science and reason instead. For the Chaos Gods, who fed on human emotion and belief, this would be a catastrophe. They decided to act before the Emperor's plans could come to fruition. In a single night, a warp storm of unprecedented power manifested within the gene laboratories themselves, tearing through the Emperor's most powerful defenses as if they were paper. The infant Primarchs, still in their gestation pods, were swept away through the warp, scattered across the galaxy like seeds on the wind. The Emperor raged at this catastrophe, mobilizing every resource at his command to search for his lost sons, but the damage was done. Each Primarch infant had been deposited on a different world, separated from their father and from each other. What followed was one of the most fascinating elements of Primarch lore. Despite being infants when they were scattered, each Primarch grew to adulthood with supernatural speed, their bodies and minds developing far faster than should have been possible. More remarkably, each one adapted to their adopted world in ways that seemed almost preordained. Lemon Russ landed on the feral ice world of Fenris and was raised by wolves, becoming the embodiment of the savage warrior. Reboot Gilliman arrived on the civilized world of Macragge and was adopted by its consul, growing into the perfect administrator and military strategist. Conrad Kurze found himself on the crime-ridden night world of Nostramo, where he became a figure of terror who brought order through fear. It was as if each Primarch's innate nature expressed itself through their environment, or perhaps shaped their environment to match their inner essence. By the time the Emperor found them during the Great Crusade, each had become a legend on their world. Some were kings, others were rebels, some were heroes, and others were darker figures who nonetheless commanded absolute loyalty from their followers. The Emperor reunited with each of his sons and gave them command of Space Marine legions that had been created using gene seed derived from their own genetic templates. The Primarchs varied enormously in their physical characteristics and abilities. At the most basic level, they were all immense, and standing head and shoulders above even the Space Marines, who were themselves far larger than normal humans. Their strength was proportional to their size, capable of tearing apart armored vehicles with their bare hands, or wielding weapons that would require machinery for a normal human to lift. Their skin was far more durable than human flesh, almost like armor in itself, and their bones were nearly unbreakable. But the physical enhancements were only part of their superiority. Each Primarch possessed a mind of staggering capacity, able to process information and make tactical decisions at speeds that made them seem prescient to normal humans. They could see patterns in chaos, predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, and devise strategies of such complexity that even the greatest human generals struggled to comprehend them. While some of this was natural genius, but much of it was the result of their enhanced cognitive functions, brains that operated at a fundamentally different level than those of normal humans. The psychic abilities of the Primarchs varied greatly. Magnus the Red was perhaps the most powerful psyker among them, after the Emperor himself, capable of feats of sorcery that could devastate entire armies or peer across vast distances of space and time. Others, like Sanguinius and Conrad Kurz, possessed the gift of foresight, though it manifested differently in each of them. Sanguinius could see multiple possible futures and choose among them, while Kurz was cursed with visions of the most terrible possible outcomes, unable to look away from the darkness that awaited. Some Primarchs had abilities that seemed to defy the normal laws of reality. Corvus Corax possessed the ability to wrap shadows around himself, making him nearly invisible, even in plain sight. Alpharius and his twin Omegon could suppress their psychic presence entirely, making themselves appear as ordinary space marines and confounding any attempts to detect them through supernatural means. Vulcan was a perpetual, unable to truly die no matter what was done to him, always returning to life eventually. Ferrus Manus had arms covered in living metal, the result of an encounter with a creature on his homeworld that might have been a Necron construct or a Citan shard. The charisma of the Primarchs was perhaps their most universally shared trait. Every one of them possessed an aura of command and presence that made them natural leaders. When a Primarch spoke, people listened. When they gave orders, those orders were followed without question. This wasn't merely psychological. Their psychic presence actively influenced those around them, inspiring loyalty and devotion that bordered on worship. Space Marines felt an instinctive bond with their Primarch, a genetic and spiritual connection that made them willing to die without hesitation if their father commanded it. This charisma extended to their enemies as well, though in a different form. Foes who looked upon a Primarch felt an instinctive dread, a recognition that they faced something beyond their ability to comprehend or defeat. Even other Primarchs felt this effect to some degree, though they were more resistant to it than normal humans. The psychic weight of a Primarch's presence could be felt by anyone sensitive to the warp, marking them as beings of tremendous spiritual power. Each Primarch also possessed specific abilities that reflected their designed purpose. Lion L. Johnson had enhanced senses that allowed him to detect warp entities and see through deception, making him the perfect hunter of chaos. Rogel Dawn had an intuitive understanding of fortification and defensive architecture, able to look at terrain and immediately see the optimal way to defend it or breach it. Jagatai Khan had supernatural speed and reflexes that made him nearly impossible to catch in combat. Lorgar possessed oratorical skills that could sway entire populations to his cause, though he also had considerable psychic power that manifested more subtly. The differences between Primarchs could be as important as their similarities. Where Robut Guilliman was methodical and preferred to fight through careful planning and logistical superiority, Angron was driven by rage and aggression, throwing himself into the thickest fighting with no regard for strategy or tactics. Where Perturabo was a genius of siege warfare and engineering, preferring to grind down his enemies through attrition and overwhelming firepower, Fulgrim was a perfectionist who sought victory through precision and artistry. These differences made the Primarchs complementary, each one suited for specific types of warfare that the others might find challenging. But for all their power and ability, the Primarchs were not invincible. Several of them died during the Horus Heresy, that terrible civil war that split the Imperium in two. Ferrus Manus was beheaded by Fulgrim at the Dropsite Massacre on Istvan V. Sanguinius was slain by the corrupted Horus during the final battle for Terra. Konrad Kurz allowed himself to be assassinated, seeing it as the only way to prove that his visions of the future were correct. These deaths proved that Primarchs could be killed, though it required tremendous force or treachery to achieve it. Others vanished under mysterious circumstances. Leman Russ departed into the Eye of Terror, searching for a way to save his corrupted brother Magnus, and was never seen again. Jagatai Khan pursued Dark Eldar raiders into the Webway and failed to return. Vulcan disappeared after completing a self-imposed quest to recover ancient artifacts he had hidden across the galaxy. Corvus Corax, after learning the truth about what he was, is departed into the Eye of Terror to wage a personal war against the demon Primarchs. Lionel Johnson lay sleeping in a hidden chamber deep within the rock, the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels, wounded and comatose though recently awakened in the current era. The fate of Reboot Guilliman is particularly relevant to our scenario. He was mortally wounded by his corrupted brother Fulgrim, stabbed with a poisoned blade that the apothecaries of the Imperium could not cure. Rather than let him die, his sons placed him in a stasis field on the throne room of Macraga, preserving him in the moment of his dying breath for 10,000 years. It was only in the current era, during the darkest days following the opening of the Great Rift, that the Eldar provided a way to revive him. He now walks the galaxy once more as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, leading humanity's forces against the countless threats that beset them. This example of Guilliman's preservation is important because it demonstrates that Primarchs can be sustained in stasis for enormous periods of time. While 10,000 years is nothing compared to the 60 million years the Necrons have slumbered, it proves that the technology exists within the galaxy to preserve these demigods indefinitely. And if Eldar stasis fields can accomplish this, then Necron technology, far more advanced than anything the younger races possess, could certainly do so as well. Now we must imagine a scenario where a Primarch, through circumstances that we shall explore, has ended up within a Necron tomb world. Perhaps they arrived there during the Great Crusade, investigating what appeared to be ancient ruins. Perhaps they were drawn there by a vision or prophecy, seeking some artifact or knowledge. Or perhaps they were the victim of treachery, placed there deliberately by enemies who wanted them removed from the galactic stage but could not kill them outright. However it happened, this Primarch has lain sleeping in the depths of the tomb, preserved by technology that might be Necron in origin, or might have been brought with them. The Necrons are now awakening from their own long sleep, their systems coming online one by one, their consciousness returning after eons of darkness. And as their awareness spreads through the tomb, as their sensors begin cataloging everything within their domain, they are about to make a discovery that will force them to confront something they cannot easily categorize or understand. Something that combines biological perfection with warp-touched essence, technology with divinity, human with something far more. The discovery of a Primarch will challenge everything the Necrons think they understand about the younger races, and how they choose to respond will have implications that echo across the entire galaxy. The moment of discovery. The awakening of a tomb world is not a sudden thing. It does not happen all at once, like flipping a switch. Instead, it is a carefully orchestrated sequence of events that can take days, months, or even years to complete. The process begins at the deepest levels of the tomb's control systems, in where ancient machine spirits that are not quite artificial intelligence, but something more complex, begin to stir from their hibernation.
You know, this whole scenario really gets me thinking about what I love most about Warhammer. Here you have the Necrons, these ancient beings who have literally slept through the entire rise and fall of civilizations, who remember fighting gods and winning. They've seen everything the galaxy has to offer, and then they wake up to find a Primarch in their tomb, and suddenly they're the ones who don't know what they're dealing with. It's that clash of perspectives that makes this so compelling to me. The Necrons think they understand the younger races, that humanity is just another upstart species that will fade away given enough time. But the Primarchs, there's something the Necrons have never accounted for. A fusion of biology and warcraft that their purely material minds struggle to categorize. It reminds us that no matter how old or how advanced you are in 40k, there's always something out there that can surprise you. And honestly, I think that's what keeps me coming back to this universe. Every faction has their moment of encountering something that breaks their understanding of how things work. It's humbling and terrifying and exciting all at once. But anyways, let's continue the story.
These systems were designed with redundancy upon redundancy, safeguards against the countless things that could go wrong during 60 million years of dormancy. The first stage involves basic diagnostic routines, automated checks that sweep through every critical system in the tomb complex. Power generation is assessed. Structural integrity is verified. The stasis crypts themselves are monitored to ensure that their precious occupants remain in perfect suspension. Any failures or anomalies are flagged for immediate attention, and the systems calculate whether the awakening can proceed safely or whether repairs must be made first. This initial phase happens entirely without conscious oversight, and carried out by programming so sophisticated that it can make decisions that appear intelligent without actually being sentient. Once the basic systems have been verified and determined to be functional, the next phase begins. This is when the canoptech constructs receive their activation signals. These machines, the scarabs and spiders and wraiths that serve as the tomb's maintenance crew and security force, begin to move through the corridors for the first time in eons. They are not truly alive, lacking the spark of consciousness that even the most basic Necron warrior possesses, but they are incredibly sophisticated machines nonetheless. Their programming allows them to repair damage, eliminate intruders, and prepare the tomb for the return of its rightful inhabitants. The canoptech constructs work methodically, while their movements precise and efficient. They repair damage caused by time or geological shifts. They clear away debris and seal any breaches in the tomb's outer walls. They eliminate any creatures or threats that have somehow found their way into the complex, be they animals, fungus, or more dangerous intruders. This phase can take weeks or even months, as the constructs work to ensure that when the Necrons awaken, they will emerge into an environment that is safe and ready for their use. Only after the canoptech constructs have completed their work does the real awakening begin. The first to rise are typically the cryptechs, those techno-mages who serve as the Necrons' scientists and engineers. These individuals possess knowledge of technologies that the younger races could barely comprehend, and they need to assess the state of the tomb with their own sophisticated consciousness before the awakening proceeds further. They examine the work done by the canoptech constructs, verify that all systems are functioning within acceptable parameters, and make decisions about which sections of the tomb should be revived first. The cryptechs also perform another vital function during the awakening. They establish communication with other tomb worlds, sending out signals through channels that exist partially outside normal space. These signals serve multiple purposes. They alert other awakened Necron forces to this tomb's activation, potentially summoning allies if threats are detected. They gather intelligence about the current state of the galaxy, downloading whatever information is available about the younger races, warp activity, and strategic situations. And they allow the tomb's leadership to coordinate their awakening with broader dynastic plans, ensuring that their re-emergence serves the greater goals of their dynasty. Once the cryptechs have given their approval, the awakening proceeds to the military forces. Necron warriors begin to rise from their stasis crypts, their consciousness flickering back to something approximating awareness. These basic troops are not given to deep thought or complex reasoning. Their minds are too degraded for that, their consciousness reduced to little more than the ability to follow orders and operate their weapons. But they are numerous and relentless, perfect soldiers for holding territory, while more sophisticated forces are prepared. As the warriors secure the tomb, higher-ranking Necrons begin to awaken. As Immortals and Lichguard, whose minds retain more of their original personality and tactical acumen. Deathmarks and Flayed Ones, specialists whose dark purposes require at least some vestige of independent thought. Destroyer cultists, whose madness and hatred of all living things has ironically preserved a sort of twisted consciousness that drives them to seek out and annihilate biological life wherever they find it. Finally, the true leadership awakens. Necron lords, each one a noble who commanded respect and power in the days of flesh, rise from their ornate sarcophagi. They assess their forces, receive briefings from the cryptechs about the current situation, and begin to make strategic decisions about how to proceed. Above them, are Necron overlords who rule over multiple tomb complexes, or even entire worlds, make their return to consciousness, their ambitions and schemes resuming after their long sleep, as if no time had passed at all. And at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, the Pharaon, the ruler of an entire dynasty, emerges to take command of everything. It is into this awakening process that the discovery of the Primarch intrudes. Let us imagine a specific scenario to ground our exploration. The tomb world is called Sekhem-Tar, a minor holding of the Sautek dynasty, located in what humans would call the Ultima Segmentum. During the War in Heaven, this world served as a staging ground for attacks against Old One holdings in neighboring systems. After the war ended, it was converted into a tomb complex that housed approximately 2 million Necrons, mostly warriors and basic military forces, though it also contained a respectable court of nobles and cryptex. Sekhem-Tar's awakening was triggered by seismic activity caused by increased tectonic movement. The planet's geology had shifted significantly during the 60 million years of the Great Sleep, and recent volcanic eruptions had begun to threaten the integrity of some of the tomb's outer chambers. The awakening protocols engaged automatically, following pre-programmed parameters that prioritize saving the sleeping Necrons from geological disaster. Canoptech constructs swarmed through the corridors, assessing damage and beginning repairs, while the control systems made calculations about how quickly different sections of the tomb could be safely revived. The cryptech Ojan was the first to achieve full consciousness, his sophisticated necrodermis body coming online with the smooth efficiency of technology that had been maintained perfectly for eons. His optical sensors flickered to life, casting green light across the inner walls of his sarcophagus before the seal released and the lid swung open. He sat up slowly, running diagnostic routines through his own systems before stepping out into the chamber. Around him, other cryptechs were beginning to stir, though he had been deliberately given priority awakening as the most senior technomancer in the tomb. Ojan moved through the tomb with purpose, his enhanced sensors sweeping every corridor and chamber, cross-referencing what he found with the data being provided by the central control systems. The damage was worse than the automated systems had initially calculated. Several sections of the tomb had been crushed by geological shifts, the Necrons within them destroyed beyond recovery. But the core sections had survived intact, and the majority of the sleeping host could be safely revived. He began the process of awakening the military forces, prioritizing the defense of critical areas while the repairs continued. It was during a routine sensor sweep of the tomb's lower galleries that Ojan detected something anomalous. The sensors registered a chamber that should have been empty, used during the War in Heaven to store captured Old One artifacts, but emptied before the Great Sleep. Yet the readings showed that something was there, something that radiated a strange energy signature, unlike anything in the tomb's databases. The power readings were minimal, suggesting that whatever was there was either dormant or very well shielded, but its mere presence in a supposedly empty chamber demanded investigation. Ojan diverted a contingent of recently awakened Necron warriors to the chamber, sending them down through levels of the tomb that had not been disturbed in 60 million years. The warriors moved in perfect silence, their Gauss flares at the ready, their empty minds focused entirely on the order they had been given. Secure the anomalous chamber and report on its contents. Behind them, at a more measured pace, Ojan himself descended, his curiosity aroused by the readings his sensors were providing. The chamber was located in one of the deepest parts of the tomb, far below even the primary crypt chambers where the sleeping Necrons had rested. It was a large space, as its walls covered with the intricate patterns that characterized Necron architecture, mathematical formulas, and astronomical charts that served both decorative and functional purposes. But the chamber was not empty. In its center, surrounded by a field of energy that Ojan's sensors struggled to analyze, was a structure that had not been there when the tomb was sealed. It appeared to be some form of stasis casket, though its design was unlike anything Necron in origin. The materials were primitive by Necron standards, metals and ceramics that showed signs of advanced craftsmanship for a younger race, but were crude compared to living metal and hyperdimensional alloys. Yet the stasis field around it was sophisticated, maintaining a temporal bubble that kept whatever was inside frozen in a single moment of time. In the field was not Necron technology, but it was operating on principles that the Necrons understood well. More intriguingly, the casket radiated a secondary energy signature that Ojan's sensors identified as warp-based. This was unusual in the extreme, Necrons had long ago lost their connection to the warp, their souls consumed during biotransference. They could detect warp energy, of course, and had developed technologies to manipulate or nullify it, but they could no longer interact with it directly. The fact that something within this chamber was radiating warp energy suggested that it contained biological life of some kind, something with a soul that burned in the Imperium. Orjan ordered the warriors to establish a perimeter around the casket while he conducted a detailed analysis. His sensors probed the stasis field from every angle, gradually building up a picture of what lay within. The readings were remarkable. The casket contained a single humanoid figure, biological in nature, but of proportions that exceeded normal human parameters by a significant margin. The entity was approximately 3 meters in height, far larger than the baseline humans the Necrons had occasionally encountered during their premature awakenings in earlier millennia. The figure's vital signs were suspended in perfect stasis, but the readings suggested a level of biological sophistication that should not be possible for a species as primitive as humanity. The cellular structure was incredibly dense and efficient. The musculature showed a level of development that would require artificial enhancement. The skeletal system appeared to be nearly unbreakable, reinforced at the molecular level with structures that resembled ceramics more than bone. This was no ordinary human. It was something that had been deliberately crafted, enhanced beyond natural limits through technology and perhaps something else as well. Most remarkable of all was the warp signature. The entity's soul burned with an intensity that Orjan's sensors could barely measure. It was a concentration of psychic power that suggested tremendous capability, though it was currently dormant, quiescent within the stasis field. The Cryptek had encountered powerful psychers before during his brief awakenings in earlier eras, but nothing quite like this. The soul was not merely powerful, it was refined, shaped, as if it had been deliberately crafted just as surely as the physical body had been. Orjan's consciousness, sophisticated though it was after millions of years of being locked in metal, struggled to process what he was seeing. The younger races were not supposed to be capable of creating something like this. Their genetic technology was crude, barely above the level of selective breeding in most cases. Their understanding of the warp was primitive and dangerous, more likely to result in possession or mutation than deliberate enhancement. Yet here was evidence of both genetic engineering and warp manipulation at a level that approached, though certainly did not match, the capabilities of the old ones themselves. The implications were staggering. If humanity had developed the ability to create beings of this caliber, yet then they were far more dangerous than the Necrons had believed. The reports from other awakened tomb worlds spoke of humans as numerous, but weak, individually fragile and dependent on their crude technology to survive. But if they could create soldiers like this, warriors who combined the advantages of biological adaptability with artificial enhancement and psychic power, then they represented a threat that could not be dismissed. The Sautek dynasty would need to know about this. The Silent King himself would need to be informed. But before any of that could happen, Orjan needed to understand exactly what he had found. He needed to know where this being had come from, how it had ended up in a sealed Necron tomb world, and most importantly, what it was capable of. The stasis casket would need to be opened and examined. The entity within would need to be studied, its capabilities assessed, its nature determined. And if it proved to be too dangerous to keep intact, it would need to be destroyed in a way that ensured no trace of it remained. The Cryptek sent a signal back to the upper levels of the tomb, requesting that Overlord Tarketh be awakened ahead of schedule. The Overlord was the highest-ranking noble in the tomb, and a discovery of this magnitude required his authority to proceed. While waiting for Tarketh to achieve consciousness, Orjan set up sensor arrays around the casket, gathering as much data as he could without disturbing the stasis field. He documented every detail, creating a comprehensive record that could be transmitted to other Necron forces if necessary. Overlord Tarketh arrived in the chamber several hours later, his towering form moving with the fluid grace that marked the highest quality necrodermis bodies. His optical sensors, glowing with a cold green light, swept across the chamber before focusing on the casket. Ojan provided a complete briefing, detailing everything they had discovered about the mysterious occupant. Tarketh listened in silence, his consciousness processing the information with the sophisticated reasoning that had made him a respected noble among the Sautek dynasty. When Ojan finished his report, Tarketh stood in silence for several moments, his senses fixed on the casket. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the harmonic resonance that marked Necron's speech, a sound that was simultaneously mechanical and strangely organic. "This entity," he said, "is unlike anything in our databases from the War in Heaven, and its warp signature suggests a power level that approaches that of the ancient psykers we faced in those conflicts, yet it is contained within a physical form of remarkable durability. The genetic engineering alone represents a level of sophistication that the younger races should not possess." Ojan indicated agreement. "The question becomes what we should do with it, my lord. The simplest solution would be to destroy it while it remains in stasis, eliminating a potential threat before it can awaken and potentially cause damage to the tomb. However, the scientific value of studying such an entity is considerable. We could learn much about the current capabilities of humanity and perhaps discover weaknesses that could be exploited in our reconquest of the galaxy." Tarketh considered this. And the Necrons were not a species given to hasty decisions, particularly not when the stakes were so high. A being of this power, if awakened and hostile, could potentially damage or even destroy significant portions of the tomb before being contained. Yet the knowledge that could be gained from study was tempting. The Necrons had been asleep for 60 million years. The galaxy had changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. Every piece of information about the current state of the younger races was valuable. "Contact the tomb world of Mandragora," Tarketh ordered. "Request consultation with Farron Imhotep, the Stormlord. A discovery of this magnitude requires the wisdom of our dynasty's ruler. While we await his response, begin preparing containment protocols. If we decide to awaken this entity for study, but we must ensure that it cannot escape or cause harm to our forces. Also, investigate the casket itself, determine how it came to be here, and whether there are any records in our databases that might explain this presence." The order given, both Necrons set about their tasks. They did not yet understand that what they had found was not simply an enhanced human or an unusual psyker. They had discovered one of the Emperor's own sons, a Primarch, whose very existence represented the culmination of human ambition and supernatural power combined. The question of which Primarch it might be, and how they came to be entombed on a Necron world, would need to be answered before the full implications of this discovery could be understood. But regardless of the specific identity, and one thing was certain, the awakening Necrons of Sekemtar had stumbled upon something that would force them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about humanity and its place in the galaxy. And the decisions they made in response to this discovery would ripple outward, potentially affecting the balance of power between the ancient dynasties and the Imperium of man in ways that neither side could fully anticipate. The tomb continued its awakening around them, more and more Necrons rising from their stasis sleep, unaware that their leaders were grappling with a mystery that had no precedent in their millions of years of recorded history. Somewhere in the depths of the tomb, a Primarch slept on, preserved in the moment between life and death, waiting for whatever fate the Necrons would decide for them. Yeah, the sons of the Emperor were meant to be humanity's greatest weapons, its brightest hopes, its mightiest defenders. Now one of them was in the hands of an enemy older than humanity itself, and the consequences of that fact would shake the foundations of the galaxy, the hierarchy of decision. The message sent to Mandragora traveled through channels that existed partially outside the normal flow of space and time. Necron communication technology was far more sophisticated than the crude astropathic networks or physical couriers that the younger races relied upon. Information could be transmitted across vast interstellar distances almost instantaneously, encoded in ways that made interception nearly impossible, and interpretation without the proper decryption protocols completely futile. The message from Sekemtar contained a complete data package, sensor readings, analysis reports, visual documentation, and Overlord Tarketh's own assessment of the situation. On Mandragora, the crown world of the Sautek dynasty and seat of Pharaon Imhotep, the Stormlord's power, the message was received by one of the Pharaon's many court cryptechs. These technomancers served as advisors, scientists, and strategists, their sophisticated minds devoted to maintaining the dynasty's technological superiority and strategic position. The cryptech who received the message was named Ankat, a specialist in xenobiology who had studied the various species of the galaxy during the dynasty's gradual awakening. Ankat processed the data package in moments, his consciousness accelerating to speeds that would have been incomprehensible to biological minds. What he saw caused something that might have been surprise to flicker through his neural pathways. The entity in stasis was clearly a product of the species known as humanity, those aggressive apes who had somehow spread across much of the galaxy despite their obvious physical limitations. But it was unlike any human Ankat had encountered or studied. The biological specifications alone were remarkable. The warp signature was unprecedented. He prepared a briefing for Imhotep, highlighting the most significant findings and providing context from his own extensive databases. Ankat had been awakened for nearly 2 centuries now, considerably longer than most of the Sautek dynasty, and he had spent much of that time studying the Imperium of man. He understood their military organization, their religious fanaticism, their dependence on a mysterious figure they called the God Emperor. This entity from Sekemtar appeared to be connected to that empire in some way, but Ankat could not yet determine the precise nature of that connection. Imhotep the Stormlord received the briefing while conducting a review of military deployments across the 17 tomb worlds that had fully awakened under his direct command. The Pharaon was a being of terrible intellect and ambition, perhaps the most successful Necron overlord in the current era. His strategic acumen had led the Sautek dynasty to conquer 80 tomb worlds, creating the largest unified Necron force in the galaxy. He had defeated countless enemies, from greenskin hordes to Eldar corsairs to Imperial crusade fleets. His reputation was such that other pharaohs, rulers of their own dynasties, had treated with him as an equal, or even deferred to his judgment on strategic matters. Imhotep examined the data with the attention to detail that had made him a legend among his kind. He reviewed every sensor reading, cross-referenced them with historical databases from the War in Heaven, and came to a conclusion that made him reassess humanity's threat level significantly. This entity, whatever its precise nature, represented a capability that the Necrons had not anticipated. The biological engineering was advanced enough to suggest that humanity had somehow recovered technology from the Dark Age that should have been lost to them. The warp manipulation was even more concerning, suggesting a sophistication in dealing with the Imperium that few species had ever achieved. But the Pharaon composed a response that would be transmitted not only to Sekemtar, but also to several other important figures within the dynasty. He wanted multiple perspectives on this discovery, multiple analytical approaches to determining what it meant and how it should be handled. The message went to Cryptek Ojan on Sekemtar, to Ankat on Mandragora, to Overlord Nassar of the client Sekemtar dynasty, and to several other nobles and cryptechs whose expertise might be relevant. He also, though he did not inform the others of this, sent a carefully encrypted message to a neutral party on the tomb world of Solemnas, to an overlord whose interests in such matters were well known. Trazin the Infinite, archaeovist of the Solemnes galleries, and perhaps the strangest Necron in the entire galaxy, or received Imhotep's message with what might have been called delight if Necrons were still capable of such emotion. Trazin was not part of the Sautek dynasty. He ruled his own world as an independent power, answerable to no pharaon. His obsession was the collection and preservation of artifacts, specimens, and even entire moments of history, all carefully catalogued and displayed in the vast galleries that filled his tomb world. He had collected everything from ancient pre-imperial human artifacts to Eldar Wraithbone choirs, to captured moments of famous battles, all preserved in stasis or holographic recreation. The idea of a genetically enhanced human supersoldier with warp-touched capabilities would have been interesting enough to Trazyn on its own merits. But Imhotep's message included a detail that made the collector's circuits hum with excitement. The analysis suggested that this entity might be one of a series, a template from which others had been created. If that were true, then finding and collecting examples of each variant would be a project worthy of centuries of effort. Trazyn sent a polite message back to Imhotep, requesting permission to travel to Sekemtar and examine the specimen personally. He offered to share any findings that might have military or strategic value, keeping for himself only the scientific and historical data. Imhotep considered this request carefully. Trazyn was brilliant, but also completely unreliable when his collecting obsession was aroused. He had been known to steal artifacts from under the very noses of their owners, to manipulate entire battles in order to acquire specific specimens, to take risks that no sane overlord would consider. Yet his knowledge was vast, spanning millions of years and countless civilizations. If anyone could provide insight into what Sekemtar had discovered, it would be Trazyn. The Pharaoh gave his permission, attaching conditions that made it clear that Trazyn would be operating under Sautek dynasty authority while on Sekemtar, and that any attempt to add this specimen to his personal collection without permission would be considered an act of war. Trazyn acknowledged these conditions with the smooth assurance of someone who had no intention of following them if they proved inconvenient. He began preparations to travel to Sekemtar immediately, dispatching one of his surrogate bodies while his primary consciousness remained safely on Solemn Nice. It was a precaution he had learned to take after millennia of having his bodies destroyed by jealous rivals, hostile aliens, or simple bad luck. If this surrogate was destroyed, he could simply download into another, losing nothing more than whatever local data had not yet been transmitted back to his primary consciousness. Meanwhile, on Sekemtar itself, Cryptek Ojan was conducting his own analysis of the mysterious casket and its occupant. He had deployed specialized sensor drones that could penetrate the stasis field without disrupting it, gathering data about the entity within. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. The armor that the figure wore was sophisticated beyond what should be possible for humanity. It incorporated technologies that Ojan recognized from his study of Imperium forces: ceramite plating, power field generators, neural interface systems. But there were also elements he could not immediately identify: power sources of unusual efficiency and materials that showed evidence of molecular manipulation. More intriguing was what the sensors revealed about the entity's genetic structure. The DNA was clearly human in its base configuration, sharing the standard patterns that Ozan had documented from other human specimens. But it had been modified extensively, with entire gene sequences that had no analog in normal human genetics. Some of these modifications were clearly functional, coding for enhanced muscle development, bone density, organ efficiency, and neural capability. Others seemed to serve no obvious biological purpose, or their function either too subtle for Ojan's sensors to detect, or perhaps related to the entity's warp-touched nature in ways that purely material analysis could not reveal. The Cryptek also made an intriguing discovery about the stasis casket itself. While its construction was not Necron in origin, it was operating in close proximity to Necron technology without interference. In fact, detailed analysis suggested that it might be drawing power parasitically from the tomb's own energy grid. This would explain how it had remained active for what must have been an extended period. The tomb's power systems, designed to operate for millions of years without maintenance, had inadvertently been sustaining the casket and keeping its occupant in perfect preservation. This raised questions about how the casket had come to be in the tomb in the first place. Ojan reviewed the chamber's security logs, accessing records that dated back to before the Great Sleep. According to those logs, the chamber had been sealed and empty when the tomb was prepared for hibernation. Yet the casket was clearly present, and it had been active long enough to integrate itself into the tomb's power systems. The most logical conclusion was that the chamber had been breached at some point after the Necrons entered stasis, but before the casket was placed here. Someone, or something, had brought this entity to Sekemtar and hidden it in a location where it would remain undisturbed for an extended period. Ozjan reported these findings to Overlord Tarketh, who found himself facing an increasingly complex puzzle. The initial question of what to do with the entity had now expanded to include questions of how and why it had come to be here, who had placed it in the tomb, and what their intentions might have been. The possibility that someone had deliberately hidden this being on Sekemtar suggested a level of planning and capability that demanded respect. Breaking into a sealed Necron tomb world, even one that was dormant, should have been nearly impossible. Doing so without leaving obvious traces of the intrusion was even more remarkable. The arrival of Trazin's surrogate body 3 days later brought a new perspective to the investigation. The archaeovist of Solemnas examined the casket with sensors even more sophisticated than Ozjan's, his consciousness devoted entirely to the analysis of historical artifacts and specimens. While he walked around the casket slowly, his optical sensors shifting through different spectra of light and energy, building up a comprehensive picture that combined visual data with quantum-level scans and warp sensitivity analysis. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of what might have been satisfaction. "This," Trazin announced, "is a masterwork of bioengineering. The genetic modifications are elegant, efficient, clearly the product of sophisticated design rather than evolutionary chance or crude trial and error. The warp integration is particularly impressive. The entity's soul has been shaped, molded to enhance rather than conflict with the physical form. This is not merely a psyker who has learned to use their gift. This is a being who was created from the moment of conception to be a bridge between material and immaterial reality." He turned to face Ozjan and Tarketh, his senses gleaming with interest. "I have seen something similar to this only once before, and that was a very long time ago, during one of my early awakenings. I encountered a human military force that was far more capable than the scattered remnants I had observed in other regions. They called themselves the Legiones Astartes, and they claimed to serve an emperor who ruled from terror. Their soldiers were enhanced beyond normal human limits, though not to this degree. They spoke of their creators with reverence, calling them Primarchs." The word meant nothing to Ozjan or Tarketh, but Trazin was accessing his own vast databases, yes, pulling up records from that brief encounter centuries ago. The Primarchs were described as the Emperor's own sons, demigods who led his armies in a great crusade to reunite humanity under a single banner. Each one was supposed to embody a specific aspect of warfare, a particular excellence that made them perfect for their role. The Space Marines I encountered were created using genetic material derived from one of these Primarchs, serving as mass-produced copies of their template. He gestured toward the casket. "If my hypothesis is correct, what we have here is not a Space Marine but an actual Primarch. One of the originals, the templates from which entire legions were created. The genetic sophistication matches what would be required for such a being. The warp signature is consistent with the legends of their power. And the armor, while primitive by our standards, shows evidence of technologies that were probably unique to these demigods." Ozjan's consciousness raced with the implications. If this were truly a Primarch, then its value for study increased exponentially. Understanding how the Emperor of mankind had created these beings could provide insights into human genetic engineering capabilities, warp manipulation techniques, and perhaps even weaknesses that could be exploited. Moreover, the capture of such a significant figure would represent a tremendous propaganda victory for the Sautek dynasty. It would demonstrate that even humanity's mightiest champions were vulnerable to Necron power. Overlord Tarketh, however, was considering a different set of implications. A Primarch was not merely a powerful individual, it was a symbol, a figure around whom entire legions of Space Marines would rally. If humanity discovered that the Necrons had captured one of these demigods, the response would be tremendous. Crusade fleets would be mobilized. Resources that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere would be redirected to mount a rescue operation. The Sautek dynasty would find itself the focus of imperial wrath on a scale that could prove challenging even for their considerable forces. The question, Tarketh said slowly, is whether the potential intelligence value outweighs the strategic complications of keeping this entity. If we awaken it for study, we risk it escaping and causing damage. If we maintain it in stasis, we must devote resources to containing it and defending against inevitable rescue attempts. If we destroy it, we lose all potential for study, but eliminate any threat it might pose and deny the Imperium a valuable asset. Trazyn made a sound that might have been a chuckle if Necrons still possessed the biology for such things. There is, of course, a fourth option. You could sell it to me. I would add it to my galleries on Solemnes, where it would be perfectly safe, perfectly preserved, and available for study under controlled conditions. You would be free from the burden of guarding it, and I would consider your dynasty to be owed a significant favor that could be called upon at a time of your choosing. The offer was transparent in its self-interest, but it was not without merit. Trazyn's galleries were among the most secure facilities in the galaxy, protected by technologies and defenses that had been refined over millions of years. Yes, if the Primarch were transferred to Solemnes, it would indeed be safe from rescue attempts, at least for as long as Trazyn maintained his neutrality. And having the Archaeovist of Solemnas owe a favor to the Sautek dynasty could prove useful in future diplomatic or strategic situations. Tarketh did not answer immediately. This was a decision that would need to be escalated to Pharaon Imhotep, and perhaps even beyond him to the Silent King himself, if Sarek could be located. The capture of a Primarch was unprecedented in recorded Necron history. There was no protocol for it, no established precedent for how to handle such a situation. They would need to evaluate all options carefully. They're considering not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader strategic implications for the ongoing awakening of the Necron dynasties and their inevitable conflicts with the younger races. As the Necron leaders debated, the Primarch slept on, unaware of the discussion that would determine their fate. Whatever decision was made would have consequences that rippled far beyond this single tomb world, potentially affecting the balance of power across entire sectors of the galaxy. The Imperium of Man had lost Primarchs before, to death or corruption or mysterious disappearance, but never had one fallen into the hands of an enemy as ancient, as patient, and as utterly alien as the Necrons. The sons of the Emperor had been created to be humanity's ultimate weapons, and now one of them had become a pawn in games of strategy that spanned millions of years and involved powers that predated humanity by eons. The analysis deepens. While Overlord Tarketh consulted with Pharaon Imhotep about the political and strategic implications of the discovery, Cryptek Ozan continued his scientific analysis with increasing fascination. He had requisitioned additional equipment from other sections of the tomb, instruments that had not been used since before the Great Sleep. These were precision tools designed for analyzing biological specimens during the War in Heaven, when the Necrons had needed to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the various species created by the Old Ones. The first thing Ozan wanted to determine was the precise age of the entity. If Trazyn's hypothesis about Primarchs was correct, this being had been created relatively recently in galactic terms, possibly within the last 10,000 years, based on the timeline Trazyn had provided. But how long had it been in stasis? And more importantly, how long had it been in this particular chamber on Sekemtar? The answers to these questions could provide crucial insights into when and how the entity had arrived here. The stasis field made conventional dating techniques useless, but Ozan had access to technologies that could analyze temporal flow at the quantum level. He deployed specialized sensor drones that could detect minute variations in time's passage, measuring the degree to which the field had insulated its contents from the normal progression of causality. The results were intriguing. The stasis field had been active for approximately 8,000 years, give or take a few centuries. This dated its activation to the middle of the Imperium's history, well after the Great Crusade that Trazyn had mentioned but before the current era. More precisely, Ojan could detect that the chamber itself had been breached approximately 8,300 years ago. The seal had been broken from the outside, very carefully, by someone who understood Necron security protocols well enough to bypass them without triggering any alarms or failsafes. The intruder had brought the casket into the chamber, positioned it in the center, and established the connection to the tomb's power grid that kept the stasis field active. Then, they had resealed the chamber so carefully that the automated systems never registered that anything had changed. This level of sophistication was remarkable, as Necron security was not designed to be easily bypassed, especially not by members of the younger races whose technology was generally far inferior. Yet someone had managed to do exactly that, suggesting either tremendous skill or access to information that should not have been available to them. Ojan made a note to investigate whether there were any records of the tomb being approached or studied by outsiders during that time period, though he suspected such records would be minimal at best, given that the tomb had been fully dormant then. The question of who had placed the Primarch here led to another question. Why? What purpose would be served by hiding such a powerful being on a dormant Necron tomb world? The most obvious answer was that someone wanted to remove the Primarch from circulation without killing them, and either because they could not accomplish the death, or because they wanted to preserve the option of revival at some future date. A tomb world in stasis would be an excellent hiding place, unlikely to be discovered by anyone actively searching and protected by defenses that would activate automatically if someone tried to breach the tomb without proper authorization. Ojan considered several scenarios. Perhaps the Primarch had been betrayed by rivals within the Imperium, hidden away to prevent them from interfering in some political struggle. Perhaps they had been captured by a third party, an alien species or chaos cult, who wanted them out of the way but could not risk the consequences of killing such a significant figure. Or perhaps the Primarch had chosen to hide themselves here, seeking refuge or planning some long-term strategy that required them to be removed from active events for an extended period. Each possibility had different implications for how the Necrons should respond. If the Primarch had been hidden by enemies within the Imperium, then revealing their presence might allow the Necrons to manipulate human politics, offering to return the demigod in exchange for concessions or alliances. If they had been placed here by a third party, then finding that party and understanding their capabilities might be valuable. And if the Primarch had come here voluntarily, then they might possess information or plans that could be extracted through negotiation or interrogation. While Ojan pondered these questions, he continued his physical analysis of the entity itself. The more he studied the biological specifications, the more impressed he became with the sophistication of the design. Every system in the Primarch's body had been optimized for maximum efficiency and capability. The cardiovascular system could deliver oxygen and nutrients at rates that would support tremendous exertion without fatigue. The nervous system showed enhancements that would allow for reaction times far beyond what baseline human biology could achieve. The skeletal structure incorporated what appeared to be ceramics at the molecular level, providing strength without excessive weight. Most fascinating was the brain. The Primarch's cerebral structure was far more complex than a normal human's, with additional lobes and neural pathways that suggested capabilities well beyond ordinary cognition. Ojan recognized some of these modifications as enabling faster processing speed and greater memory capacity, functions that were conceptually similar to how Necron consciousness had been enhanced during biotransference. But there were other modifications whose purpose he could not immediately determine, structures that seemed designed to interact with the warp in ways that purely material analysis could not fully explain. The genetic coding itself was a masterpiece that Ojan found himself reluctantly admiring. The Emperor of Mankind, whoever or whatever that entity truly was, clearly possessed knowledge of bioengineering that rivaled anything the Old Ones had achieved. The modifications were stable, seamlessly integrated with the human baseline in ways that suggested they would breed true if the Primarch were ever to reproduce. There were also failsafes built into the genetic code, safeguards that would prevent certain types of mutation or corruption, though Ojan noted with interest that these failsafes appeared to have weak points that could potentially be exploited. The armor worn by the Primarch was another subject of study. Trazyn had provided some information about Imperium technology based on his own encounters, but the armor this specific Primarch wore was clearly special. It incorporated power field generators that would provide additional protection beyond the physical plating. The neural interface was far more sophisticated than what Trazyn had reported seeing on normal space marines, allowing for a level of control and response that would make the armor feel like a second skin rather than an external suit. So there were also systems whose purpose Ojan could only guess at. Exotic energy projectors, phase-shifted material that could partially exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and what appeared to be a miniaturized teleportation device. One particularly intriguing feature was a device integrated into the armor's chest plate that seemed designed to regulate the wearer's connection to the warp. Ojan's analysis suggested it was a psychic hood of some kind, a tool that would allow the Primarch to channel their warp-touched nature more effectively, while also providing protection against hostile psychic attacks. The technology was primitive by Necron standards, but it showed a clear understanding of how to manipulate the Imperium in ways that suggested the Imperium had retained some knowledge from humanity's peak. And as days passed and Ojan's analysis continued, he began to form a picture of what the Primarch truly was. It was not simply a powerful soldier or even a brilliant commander. It was a being that had been designed from conception to embody the pinnacle of what humanity could achieve through a combination of genetics, technology, and warp manipulation. Each Primarch was meant to be a demigod in the most literal sense, a being that stood between the mortal and the divine, capable of inspiring absolute loyalty through their mere presence and leading armies that spanned entire worlds. The Emperor had clearly created the Primarchs to serve as his generals during the Great Crusade, using them to unite humanity under a single banner. But Ojan suspected they were more than just military assets. They were symbols, or living representations of humanity's potential and aspiration. Each one would have embodied specific ideals or capabilities, creating a pantheon of demigods that could serve different purposes depending on the situation. Some would excel at siege warfare, others at rapid assault, still others at defense or infiltration or psychological operations. Understanding this helped Ojan appreciate the magnitude of what they had discovered. Capturing a Primarch was not simply capturing an enemy commander, it was capturing a symbol that represented everything the Imperium stood for. The psychological impact on both the Imperium's forces and on the Necrons' own population would be significant. It would prove that even the mightiest champions of the younger races were vulnerable to Necron power. And it would demonstrate that the Necrons could reach into the very heart of human civilization and take whatever they wanted. But it would also make the Necrons a target for retaliation on a scale that should not be underestimated. Ojan had accessed historical databases about the Great Crusade and subsequent Imperial military operations. When the Imperium decided to commit to a war, they could mobilize resources on a staggering scale. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, Titan legions, and specialized forces that could crack open fortified worlds. If the Imperium learned that the Necrons held a Primarch, the response would be overwhelming. Every available force would be redirected to mount a rescue operation, and they would not stop until they had recovered their demigod or confirmed its death. Yet this was the dilemma that Overlord Tarketh and Pharaon Imhotep were grappling with. The intelligence value was undeniable, but so was the danger. Keeping the Primarch meant turning Sekemtar into a target of the highest priority. Destroying it meant losing all potential for study. Transferring it to Trazyn's galleries would solve the immediate security concerns, but would place incredible power in the hands of an overlord who was not part of their dynasty and who could not be fully trusted to act in their interests. There was also the question of what information could be extracted from the Primarch if they were awakened. A being of that sophistication and power would likely have tremendous knowledge about the Imperium's military capabilities, strategic plans, and technological developments. They would know the locations of important worlds, the disposition of fleets, the capabilities of different space marine chapters. If that information could be extracted through negotiation, threat, or direct neural interface, it would be invaluable for planning the Necron reconquest of the galaxy. But awakening the Primarch also meant facing a being whose capabilities were still not fully understood. Ozan's analysis had revealed much about the physical and biological characteristics, but the true extent of their powers remained unknown. The warp signature suggested tremendous psychic potential that could manifest in unpredictable ways. The genetic enhancements indicated physical capabilities that might allow them to break free even from Necron restraints if given the opportunity. And the simple fact that they were a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, suggested that they might have access to technologies or abilities that had not yet been documented. The Trazyn solution. While Ozan continued his analysis and the various Necron authorities debated what to do, Trazyn the Infinite was conducting his own investigation into the identity of the specific Primarch they had discovered. The Archaeovist had access to databases that were both more comprehensive and more eclectic than what most Necron overlords maintained. His obsession with collecting had led him to gather information about countless civilizations, including extensive records on the Imperium of man and its history. Trazyn had cross-referenced the physical characteristics of the entity in the casket with records of the 20 Primarchs who had been created by the Emperor. Height, build, armor design, and the specific pattern of the warp signature all provided clues that could narrow down the possibilities. After careful analysis, he had formed a hypothesis about which Primarch this was, though he could not be absolutely certain without awakening the entity or accessing Imperial records that he did not possess. The identification mattered because different Primarchs had different capabilities and temperaments. Some were known for their tactical genius, others for their psychic power or their skill in personal combat. Some had remained loyal to the Emperor throughout the Civil War, called the Horus Heresy, while others had turned traitor and fled into the Eye of Terror. Knowing which specific Primarch they had would inform decisions about how dangerous they were likely to be if awakened and what information they might possess. Trazyn's analysis suggested this was most likely one of the loyalist Primarchs who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances after the heresy. The timing matched the period when several of these demigods had vanished, departing on quests or hunts, or simply disappearing without explanation. The armor design was consistent with what Trazyn had documented during his various encounters with Imperial forces over the centuries, and the warp signature, while unique, had characteristics that matched certain descriptions he had found in stolen Imperial texts. If his hypothesis was correct, this Primarch had been one of the Emperor's most trusted sons, a warrior of tremendous capability who had fought loyally throughout the Great Crusade and the subsequent Civil War. They would possess detailed knowledge of both the Imperium's military organization and its ideological foundations. They would have commanded one of the Space Marine legions, meaning they would have experience with large-scale strategic planning and logistics. And they would likely have personal knowledge of the Emperor himself, understanding the motivations and capabilities of humanity's most powerful leader in ways that few others could claim. Such knowledge made the Primarch incredibly valuable, but it also made them incredibly dangerous. A being of that sophistication would not be easily fooled or intimidated. If awakened, they would immediately assess their situation and begin planning escape or resistance. They would try to turn their captors against each other, exploiting any weaknesses in Necron unity or any disagreements about how to proceed. And if they could not escape physically, they might attempt to do so psychically, reaching out through the warp to alert others of their location, or even possessing other beings to effect their liberation. Trazyn had been thinking about these problems, and he had concluded that the only safe way to keep the Primarch was to ensure they never awakened. As long as they remained in stasis, they posed no threat and could be studied indefinitely without risk. The casket that currently held them was adequate for this purpose, but Trazyn had access to far superior technology on Solemnas. His tesseract labyrinths could trap beings in pocket dimensions where time had no meaning and escape was literally impossible. His stasis fields could freeze moments in time with such precision that not even the thoughts of those trapped within could progress. More importantly, Trazyn had the facilities to conduct extensive analysis without ever disturbing the stasis. His galleries were equipped with sensor arrays that could probe every aspect of a specimen without requiring direct physical contact or awareness on the part of the subject. He could map the Primarch's genetic structure down to the atomic level, trace every neural pathway in their brain, and even examine the structure of their soul as it manifested in the warp. All of this could be done while keeping them in perfect preservation, unchanged from the moment they had been placed in stasis. The knowledge gained from such study would be immense. Trazyn could document exactly how the Emperor had created the Primarchs, understanding the process well enough to potentially replicate it or develop countermeasures against it. He could identify weaknesses in the design that might be exploited if the Necrons ever faced Primarchs in battle. He could even begin to understand the nature of the Emperor himself, using the Primarchs as a lens through which to examine their creator. All of this made Trazyn increasingly determined to acquire the Primarch for his collection. He had made the initial offer to purchase it from the Sautek dynasty, but he knew that Pharaon Imhotep was unlikely to simply give up such a prize, even for a substantial favor. Trazyn would need to be more creative, more persuasive. He would need to demonstrate that transferring the Primarch to Solemnas was not merely in his own interest, but in the interest of all Necron dynasties. Trazyn composed a detailed proposal that he transmitted to both Overlord Tarketh and Pharaon Imhotep. The proposal outlined exactly how the Primarch would be contained on Solemnes, the security measures that would prevent rescue attempts, and the analytical protocols that would maximize the intelligence gained from study. He proposed a sharing arrangement where all data gathered from the Primarch would be made available to the Sautek dynasty and any other dynasty that Imhotep designated as worthy of such information. He even offered to create duplicate datasets that could be physically transferred to other tomb worlds, ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost, even if Solemnis itself were somehow compromised. To sweeten the offer, Trazyn included access to some of his existing collections that might be of interest to the Sautek dynasty. He had specimens and artifacts from the War in Heaven, records of ancient battles and technologies that had been lost for millions of years. He had examples of extinct species, preserved moments of historical significance, and treasures from civilizations that had risen and fallen while the Necrons slept. The Sautek dynasty could benefit from all of this if they agreed to let him add the Primarch to his galleries. The proposal was compelling, and Trazyn knew it. He had positioned the transfer not as him gaining a prize, but as the Sautek dynasty solving a problem. As they would no longer need to devote resources to guarding the Primarch, they would not become the target of imperial retaliation. They would gain access to invaluable intelligence and historical records. And they would earn the gratitude of one of the galaxy's most knowledgeable collectors, a relationship that could prove useful in countless ways over the coming centuries. Of course, Trazyn had not mentioned everything in his proposal. He had not explained that acquiring a Primarch would complete a set that he had been building for centuries, collecting examples of humanity's various super soldier programs and genetic enhancement projects. He had not revealed that he had already begun preparing a special gallery specifically designed to house specimens of this importance, as with display cases that would allow visitors to view the Primarch from all angles while absolutely ensuring that no escape was possible. And he certainly had not admitted that if the Sautek dynasty refused his offer, he was prepared to simply steal the Primarch and deal with the consequences later. Trazyn had stolen from other Necron dynasties before. He had infiltrated tomb worlds, bypassed their security, and taken artifacts that were not offered for sale or trade. His ability to transfer his consciousness into surrogate bodies made him nearly impossible to permanently stop, and his reputation as a collector was such that most overlords simply assumed that if something went missing and Trazyn had been nearby, he was the likely culprit. He would prefer to acquire the Primarch through legitimate negotiation. But if that proved impossible, alternative methods were always available. The archaeovist waited patiently for a response to his proposal, his consciousness occupied with planning both for success and for the eventuality that he might need to take more direct action. In the galleries of Solemnas, a space was being prepared. Display cases were constructed. Sensor arrays were installed and calibrated. Everything would be ready when the time came to add this most remarkable specimen to his collection. Whether that happened through agreement or through more creative means remained to be seen, but Trazyn was confident that one way or another, the Primarch would eventually rest among his treasures. The strategic calculus. While Trazyn schemed and planned, Pharaon Imhotep the Stormlord was conducting a much broader strategic analysis of the situation. The discovery of a Primarch was significant, but it did not exist in isolation. It was one piece in a complex puzzle that included the awakening of Necron tomb worlds across the galaxy, the expansion of the Imperium under its returning Primarch Robut Guilliman, the threat of the Tyranid hive fleets, and countless other factors that determined the current state of galactic power. Imhotep had been awakened long enough to have a sophisticated understanding of the Imperium of Man. He knew that they were divided into countless factions, many of which were barely aware of each other's existence. He knew that their technology varied wildly from world to world, with some maintaining sophisticated capabilities, while others had degraded to almost medieval levels. He knew that their faith in the Emperor was their greatest strength and also their greatest weakness, driving them to acts of tremendous sacrifice, but also blinding them to alternatives that might be more effective. The Primarchs were central to Imperial ideology in ways that made them more valuable than simple military assets. The Imperium worshipped them as demigods, literally believing that they were divine beings who embodied the Emperor's will. Space Marine chapters traced their lineage back to specific Primarchs, revering their genetic father with devotion that bordered on fanaticism. The loss of a Primarch during the Horus Heresy had been catastrophic for the Imperium, unfracturing legions and creating rifts that lasted for 10,000 years. If the Imperium learned that the Necrons held a Primarch, the psychological impact would be tremendous. It would prove that even their mightiest champions were vulnerable. It might cause some to question whether the Emperor's protection extended far enough to safeguard even his own sons. It could potentially drive wedges between different factions of the Imperium, as they debated how to respond and who was responsible for allowing such a catastrophe to occur. But psychological warfare cut both ways. The Necrons would be painting a target on themselves that could not be removed. Every Imperial force in the sector would make recovering or avenging the Primarch their top priority, whereas the Inquisition would mobilize resources that were usually reserved for fighting Chaos incursions or Tyranid invasions. The Space Marines would demand that their parent chapters send forces to mount a rescue operation, regardless of what other conflicts they might be engaged in. Even forces that had been fighting each other would likely declare a temporary truce to focus on retrieving the Primarch. Imhotep had to weigh these factors carefully. The intelligence value of keeping the Primarch was significant, but was it worth the military cost? The Sautek dynasty was powerful, perhaps the most powerful Necron force currently awakened, but they were not invincible. A sustained Imperial assault on Sekemtar, especially one backed by multiple Space Marine chapters and whatever other forces the Imperium could mobilize, would be challenging to repel. The Tomb World would survive, certainly, but the cost in resources and the distraction from other objectives could be substantial. There was also the question of how other Necron dynasties would react. Some might see the capture of a Primarch as a brilliant stroke that should be emulated, leading to efforts to capture other significant Imperial figures. Others might view it as reckless provocation that would draw unwanted attention to all Necrons before they were ready for full-scale war with the Imperium. Still others might simply see an opportunity to exploit the Sautek dynasty's distraction, pursuing their own agendas while Imhotep's forces were tied down, defending Sekemtar. The Pharaon had built his reputation and power on strategic acumen that few could match. He had won battles against seemingly superior forces by anticipating his enemies' responses and positioning his own forces to exploit their inevitable mistakes. He had built alliances and crushed rivals through a combination of military might and political manipulation. Now he needed to apply that same strategic thinking to the question of what to do with the discovered Primarch. One option that Imhotep was seriously considering was to use the Primarch as a bargaining chip rather than keeping it permanently. The Imperium had resources and territories that the Necrons desired. They controlled tomb worlds that had been colonized by humans during the Necrons' sleep, planets that rightfully belonged to the dynasties but would require war to reclaim. If Imhotep offered to return the Primarch in exchange for the peaceful evacuation of certain key worlds, he might be able to achieve strategic objectives without the cost of prolonged military campaigns. Of course, negotiating with the Imperium was notoriously difficult. Their ideological rigidity made them reluctant to compromise, especially on matters they viewed as moral absolutes. The idea of negotiating with Xenos, creatures they viewed as abominations to be exterminated, went against everything the Imperium claimed to believe. But Imhotep had noticed that Imperial actions did not always match Imperial rhetoric. When necessity demanded it, they were capable of pragmatism, forming temporary alliances with aliens against common enemies, or accepting outcomes they would never publicly admit to seeking. And the key would be finding the right intermediary, someone within the Imperium who had both the authority to negotiate and the pragmatism to see the value in compromise. The current Lord Commander, Reboot Guilliman, might fit that description. He was known to be more flexible than many Imperial leaders, willing to adopt unorthodox solutions if they achieved necessary results. As a fellow Primarch, he would have strong motivation to recover his lost brother. And as one of the few beings in the Imperium with truly comprehensive authority, he could make agreements that others would feel obligated to honor. But approaching Guilliman directly was risky. It would reveal the Necrons' possession of the Primarch immediately, eliminating any advantage that secrecy might provide. It would also make Imhotep personally involved in negotiations, raising the stakes and making it harder to walk away if the terms were not favorable. Perhaps a better approach would be to let information about the discovery leak slowly, allowing the Imperium to deduce what had happened rather than announcing it outright. That would give the Necrons time to prepare for the inevitable response, while also creating uncertainty that might work in their favor. Another consideration was the Silent King. Sarek had returned from his self-imposed exile and was traveling the galaxy, awakening tomb worlds and uniting the dynasties against the Tyranid threat. If he learned about the captured Primarch, he would likely have opinions about how it should be handled. Imhotep had tremendous respect for the Silent King, recognizing that Sarek's strategic vision operated on a scale that few others could comprehend. But Imhotep was also an independent pharaoh who ruled his own dynasty with absolute authority. He would listen to the Silent King's counsel, but he would not automatically defer to it. The relationship between Imhotep and Zarek was complex, characterized by mutual respect, but also by the understanding that they sometimes had different priorities. The Silent King was focused on preparing the Necrons to face the Tyranid threat, viewing it as an existential danger that required all resources to combat. Imhotep shared that concern, but was also focused on rebuilding the Sautek dynasty's power and influence, knowing that when the Tyranid threat was finally dealt with, the political landscape among the Necrons would be reshaped by who had positioned themselves most effectively. As Sarek might argue that holding a Primarch was an unnecessary distraction from the Tyranid threat, or he might see value in using it to manipulate the Imperium, potentially convincing them to commit forces against the Tyranids that would otherwise be deployed elsewhere. The Silent King's thinking was always layers deep, considering implications and outcomes that others missed. Whatever his position, it would be well-reasoned and strategic, deserving serious consideration even if Imhotep ultimately chose a different path. As Imhotep deliberated, he was also gathering information about the specific Primarch they had captured, cross-referencing Trazine's analysis with his own intelligence databases. Knowing which Primarch it was would inform his decisions significantly. Some Primarchs would be more valuable as hostages than others. Yes, some would possess knowledge that was more tactically relevant, and some would generate stronger responses from the Imperium, either because they were better loved or because they commanded the loyalty of particularly powerful forces. The Pharaon was also considering a longer game. What if the Primarch could be turned? What if, through persuasion or manipulation, or simply by demonstrating the futility of resistance, the demigod could be convinced to serve Necron interests? It seemed unlikely, given what was known about Imperial ideology and the Primarch's legendary loyalty to the Emperor. But the Necrons had technologies that could alter memories, suppress certain thoughts, even rewrite neural patterns if given enough time and opportunity. A Primarch who publicly defected to the Necrons would be a propaganda victory beyond measure, as potentially fracturing the Imperium in ways that military force never could. Of course, attempting such a conversion would be extremely risky. A Primarch who pretended to be turned while secretly remaining loyal could cause tremendous damage from within. Their charisma and tactical genius could potentially sway Necrons to their cause, or at least create confusion and division. And if the conversion attempt failed, and the Primarch escaped with knowledge of Necron capabilities and plans, the intelligence loss would be catastrophic. All of these considerations swirled through Imhotep's consciousness as he reviewed reports from across the Sautek dynasty. He was coordinating the awakening of 5 additional tomb worlds, managing conflicts with greenskin hordes in 3 systems, and preparing for a major offensive against an elder Corsair base that had been raiding dynasty holdings. The question of what to do with the Primarch was important, but it was not the only matter demanding his attention. He needed to make a decision soon, but he also needed to make the right decision, one that would serve the dynasty's interests over the long term, rather than simply solving an immediate problem. After several days of deliberation, Imhotep made his choice. He would authorize Trazyn to take the Primarch to Solemnas, but under conditions that ensured the Sautek dynasty maintained access to all intelligence gathered. He would also begin subtle diplomatic probing with the Imperium, using intermediaries to feel out whether negotiation was possible without committing to any specific course of action. And he would notify the Silent King of the discovery, seeking counsel while making it clear that final authority over the disposition of the Primarch remained with the Sautek dynasty. It was a carefully balanced approach that kept multiple options open while minimizing immediate risk. The Primarch would be safely contained on Solemneke, protected by Trazyn's formidable defenses and removed from any direct threat of rescue. The intelligence gathering could proceed without pause, and if the situation changed or new opportunities emerged, Imhotep would still have the flexibility to adjust his strategy accordingly. Overlord Tarketh received the Pharaon's orders with a mixture of relief and regret. Relief because the burden of guarding the Primarch would no longer fall on Sekemtar's forces, but regret because handing over such a significant discovery to another, even one as reliable as Trazyn, felt like a loss of prestige. But Tarketh was a loyal subordinate to Imhotep, and he recognized the wisdom in the Pharaon's decision, even if he did not entirely agree with all aspects of it. The transfer was arranged with careful attention to security. Trazyn would bring his personal vessel, the Shroud-class light cruiser, Lord of Antiquity, to Sekemtar. The Primarch's stasis casket would be loaded aboard under heavy guard, transported through the tomb to the surface, and then into orbit. Once safely aboard Trazyn's ship, it would be taken through a carefully plotted course to Solemnes, avoiding any regions where Imperial forces were known to operate. The entire operation would be completed within a week, us minimizing the window during which something could go wrong. As preparations for the transfer were made, Cryptek Ojan completed his final analysis of the Primarch, documenting everything his sensors could detect while the specimen was still on Sekemtar. He created a comprehensive database that included genetic maps, physiological assessments, technological analyses of the armor and equipment, and detailed observations about the warp signature. This data was transmitted to both Trazyn and to Pharaon Imhotep's personal archives, ensuring that even if something happened to the physical specimen, the knowledge gathered would not be lost. The Primarch, still unconscious in their stasis casket, had no awareness of these discussions and decisions. They did not know that they had become a prize being passed between ancient powers, a specimen to be studied and analyzed by minds that were millions of years old. They did not know that their capture had already influenced strategic calculations across multiple Necron dynasties, or that their eventual fate might depend on negotiations and manipulations that were still being planned. But somewhere in the depths of the warp, something was beginning to stir. The Primarch's soul, though dimmed by stasis, still burned bright enough to be noticed by those who could perceive such things. Entities that watched from the Imperium, servants of the Emperor who monitored threats to the Imperium, perhaps even the Emperor himself from his prison on the Golden Throne, might have noticed the disturbance. The galaxy's most powerful psychers might have felt a ripple, a sense that something significant had changed, though they might not yet understand exactly what. The discovery of the Primarch on Sekemtar was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a chain of consequences that would reach far beyond a single tomb world or even a single dynasty. And as the Necrons began to understand what they had truly found, and as the Imperium slowly became aware that one of their greatest champions had fallen into alien hands, the stage was being set for conflicts and complications that neither side could fully anticipate. The age of the Primarchs had supposedly ended with the Horus heresy, but it seemed that history was not yet finished with these demigods, and the Necrons, who had seen civilizations rise and fall across 60 million years, were about to discover that some forces in the galaxy could not be easily contained or understood. It's no matter how advanced their technology or how ancient their knowledge might be. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Necron and Primarch lore. If you found this video informative and engaging, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment below, sharing your thoughts. Your support helps the channel grow and allows us to continue diving deep into the fascinating universe of Warhammer 40,000.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.